Hello, everybody, and welcome to Project HR, a podcast dedicated to building better workplaces. Project HR is brought to you by IRI Consultants. IRI empowers leaders to prevent and solve mission-critical workforce issues through holistic and sustainable strategies. For more information, you can visit IRI at iriconsultants.com. I am Jennifer Oraquah, Director of Business Development for IRI, and your host for this episode of Project HR. Now, AI-driven technology has become indispensable for companies worldwide. And according to Predictive Hire, 55% of hiring managers have invested in AI recruitment. And most Fortune 500 companies are using some sort of AI technology to filter resumes. But are we ready for AI interviews? Or more importantly, are AI interviews ready for us? In today's episode, I'm joined by Hilke Schellmann. Hilke is an Emmy Award-Winning journalist and a journalism professor at New York University. And in 2021, she addressed this very question in a 4-part investigative report into automated hiring practices for MIT Technology Review's podcast, In Machines We Trust. Hilke, thanks so much for talking with me today on Project HR.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So, Hilke, how did you first get interested in artificial intelligence?
So I first got interested because I was at a conference in Washington, D.C. that had nothing to do with artificial intelligence. It was a bunch of lawyers talking about consumer rights, and I needed a ride from the conference center to Union Station to take a train back to New York. And I took a Lyft ride, and I chatted with the driver, and I asked him, "How was your day?" And he actually hesitated and was like, it's been a really weird day. I'm a reporter. So I was like, oh, really? Tell me more. And he said, well, I really had a weird day because I was just interviewed by a robot. And I was like, interviewed by a robot? So he told me that he had applied for a baggage handler position at a local airport. And, he got basically a recorded voice calling him and asking 3 questions. So I took a note. This was in late 2017. And I was like, oh, I never heard of that. I'm going to take a note. I'm a reporter. Maybe there's a story here. I kind of forgot about it. A few months later, I went to an artificial intelligence conference, and there was somebody who had just left the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and she said, folks need to look into this, that, there are algorithms that go through people's calendars and emails, and they make certain assumptions about how good of a worker you are, and people should start looking into this. And I was like, okay, apparently there's a bunch of people, who are telling me this is something. So after this, I went to another conference and saw one of the AI-based video interviews vendors giving a presentation showing exactly how their, video interview AI measures facial expressions and tone of voice. And I was mesmerized, and I thought like, wow, this might be magic here. I really need to look into this.
So that's a fascinating story, but how did you get involved with the In Machines We Trust podcast?
So I got involved with In Machines We Trust because I was writing an article for MIT Technology Review, which was about auditing of AI-based algorithms used in hiring. And the executive producer of the podcast learned about the story and was really interested in it. And then we started speaking. And Jennifer Strong and I crossed paths at the Wall Street Journal years ago. And, we kept chatting, and I had, so much knowledge. And she was like, wait a second, we should really do a deep dive here. And how about doing a 4-part series? And I was like, sure. I think there's a lot here to be discussed. And, I think it should be discussed on a podcast.
Well, and AI interviews were just one part of the 4-part series. What were the other automated hiring practices that were discussed?
Yeah, so we looked at a bunch of them. So, and maybe this is a good moment to sort of explain where we find AI in hiring. So this might be a good moment to explain where we find AI in what HR folks call the hiring funnel, right? So you see it in even building a candidate pool, right? We can now use AI to find folks that we want to put in the candidate pool. Then we see it, all the major job platforms, be it LinkedIn, Indeed, ZipRecruiter, they all use kind of forms of AI, right? And then we have potentially AI and applicant tracking system used by individual companies. Then we have it in sort of the next round of hiring. Often, we see AI games, video games that folks can play to pull out their personality traits. We may see AI in job interviews. So I think those are probably the most used forms of AI. We also see it in background checks. We also see it in social media analysis. So it's kind of everywhere in the hiring process.
So there may be varying levels of knowledge out there regarding AI and how the interview process works with AI. Can you describe for us what that's like?
Yeah. So traditionally, job interviews, you sit with an HR manager or the hiring manager in a room, right? They ask you a question and you have a chat. You might do that over Zoom. So the way video interviews work is there's no one on the other side. You get pre recorded questions on your monitor, on your phone, and you record yourself answering. And then those answers are being assessed by artificial intelligence. So it can assess many different things. It can assess the words that you use and compare it to the words that other folks who were previously job applicants, who are now in the job, who have been hired, used. So can compare, does she use the same words? That could be a prediction of success. It could be some companies use intonation of your voice. We've seen some companies use facial expression analysis to understand, were you smiling like other people were smiling. Most companies have abandoned that because there's been a lot of critiques and there's a lot of questions if the science underneath that is solid. But yeah, there are multiple ways that folks can be scored by an AI video interview.
Yeah. Well, in full disclosure here, with this podcast coming up, I had talked to several of my friends in the HR space, and their opinions vary wildly on AI interviewing. So, what was your perception of AI interviewing before the investigation, and did it change as a result of what you learned?
I mean, I was pretty open to it. I was like, whoa, this is like a super interesting new way of doing interviews. And I've done, a fair share of job interviews. And I get nervous, and I really get nervous when there are like six people on the other side of the table. So I was like, I mean, maybe being by myself in a room and just talking to a screen takes away a lot of the anxiety and the nervousness I feel. And I do have to say that when I started digging into it, what is like really helpful about video job interviews, there doesn't have to be necessarily an AI on the other side, right? So they can be used in two ways. Like you get pre-recorded questions or just written questions on a screen, and you record yourself essentially answering them, right? So it's like sort of giving a presentation of yourself. There's no one on the other side.
Mm.
So either an HR manager can watch all these, or an AI can analyze certain features about me. And so I think what's good about these interviews is that they force the companies to have a structured interviewing process, meaning you have to ask every candidate the same question.
Hmm.
And I think in like human to human interviews, we often get off track because we talk about the schools we went to, people we know. And that's where a lot of bias comes in. So I think it is helpful to have the structured interview process. I've talked to now many people who've done one-way video interviews, as I call them, and it's often done on recent college graduates and folks who apply for like hourly jobs in like fast food or in retail. And most of the people are not in favor. They feel it's kind of like impersonal. They don't get to ask questions to the company, right? They feel like this is just a
Hmm.
one-way process. And there isn't somebody on the other side where they can ask questions about the job, right? So that isn't part of the process.
So, what was your investigative process as you learned about this?
So my investigation was to look into, do these AI-based job interviews work? And what I looked at is especially how companies market these video interviews. So they say it's more efficient. And I absolutely believe that. I'm sure it's way more efficient to schedule people via one-way video interviews than actually having, a live person on the other side. You have to schedule them. It takes forever. You have to take off work to go there. It's a lot. So
Hmm.
doing
Hmm.
doing this job interview, great. It saves labor cost for the HR department, probably because it's much faster. You can just watch 15 minutes of a video with everyone talking, or you even have an AI do the ranking. Totally. And then the third part of the marketing pitch that I heard over and over again is that the AI interview process finds the best job applicants. And I was trying to figure that out. Like, does it do that? And is the process fair for everyone?
Hmm.
And I think that's something we really need to look into.
All right, okay, I'm going to take a quick sponsorship break right now, but when we return, I want to talk about what your investigation revealed about AI interviews. Stay with us.
Labor relations is changing rapidly, and it can be frustrating if the tools you're using are not keeping pace. If you spend too much time searching for what you need, or you find it challenging to collaborate with your team, it's time to think about your employee communication resources in a different way. You need a labor relations platform that will help you connect with and educate employees. Proofbox solves these problems by offering a robust labor relations library of videos, e-learning, and ready-to-use websites at an affordable price. Whether educating employees or supervisors in preventive mode or in the middle of a union organizing campaign, Proofbox is like Netflix for labor relations. Learn more today at bit.ly/proofbox and make sure your tools are keeping up with the pace of labor relations today.
I'm back now with reporter and NYU journalism professor Hilke Schellmann. Hilke, your podcast series featured on In Machines We Trust was beautifully put together and so informative. I definitely want to encourage our listeners to go listen to that series. And of course, we'll put links to it in our episode companion. But you also authored an article for MIT Technology Review about this series, and that'll be linked as well.
Yes. So we did a whole investigation, 4 parts, looking into the beginning of the funnel, the end of the funnel, testing all of these technology tools to really understand how's the world of hiring changing now that we see AI moving into the space. And also, we particularly looked at these AI-based interviews because that's one of the biggest features that companies are drawn to.
So before the break, we talked about your investigative process, and in it, you focused on a handful of firms that specialized in AI job interviews. What was the criteria for choosing those firms that you looked at?
So the criteria for choosing the different companies was that we wanted to make sure that they have, a certain market share, that there's something interesting about them, and that we have access to actually testing their AI. So I can also say we tested actually a bunch more in the background, but there's only so much you can put in the reporting. But we wanted to make sure we are on solid footing here. So I actually have a spreadsheet with all of this, with all of the testing. It's going to be part of my book, but it wasn't part of the podcast.
Okay.
But in the podcast, we took a deep dive into 2 technologies that use AI for job interviews. And one was a company that says it can find your level, your competency level in English with an AI. So I was really intrigued by this, and I was like, wow, it's really interesting. This is, a company that pitches its services to, mostly US and Western European companies that have to have call centers abroad where folks need to speak English. So they want to know, is this person competent speaking English? So why not have an AI do that testing? So what you do is you get a phone call, you answer it, and then you answer the questions. They usually, HR managers can choose them, like, why do you want to work here? Talk about, your weaknesses and your strength. What was a recent obstacle you've overcome at work? I mean, pretty, questions we've all been asked.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that you were writing a book about this investigation. What kind of a deeper dive are you looking into there?
Yeah, it's super exciting. This is my first book. So I've now done almost 4 years, probably more like 5 years of research into this. So I'm taking a really deep dive into really in a lot of these technologies and do even more testing. And, there's a bunch more investigative revelations. And I'm busy writing the book. So I have to turn it in a couple months, and then it's going to come out hopefully in early 2024.
Nice, nice. And now you let yourself be the guinea pig for some of these tests with the AI. What was that like?
It's a little bit unnerving, to be honest. It's actually, I feel like I want to sort of understand what job applicants go through. So, let me do the test myself as well. And, it's actually a little hard. Sometimes you sit in front of the computer and you get okay, this is they're asking me questions for a job interview, but this AI actually is also going to pull out my personality traits. It feels somewhat invasive, is this tool going to know more about me than I know about myself? I was really a little nervous at the beginning. Then I got somewhat used to doing a lot of these tests, but it is a little unnerving. And I sort of learned more and understood what job applicants feel, because they really have strong feelings about this. There's a couple that I've spoke to that felt like, they weren't in love with the one-way video interviewing process, but they liked that it was flexible, that they could do it on their own time and they can do it, Sunday at 2 a.m.
Hmm.
They liked that about it, but most people said it was a weirdly depersonalizing experience. And I can feel that too, that, it feels like, oh, I'm being asked a bunch of questions, but I don't actually get to ask any. And I don't have anyone on the other side who even says, right? Or like looks at you and you have a conversation. It's like you're just talking to a wall. And, that can be unnerving.
So, what were your key takeaways, both from your experience and from your research?
So, what we found out is that the tools that we tested all had flaws. And you know, that was not an easy takeaway because I know that these tools are being used on people. And they're made for high stakes decisions. So, I think we really need to talk about this and figure out how can we make sure that these tools work that we use.
So, were you surprised by those findings?
Yes. Yes, I was. I mean, I thought that like if you go to market with a tool and you say, this tool can understand how competent you are speaking English, and then it really can't. Or, another tool that we tested where you do a video interview and you get your personality traits, the big five back from it. And I had like so many different personalities and it's such a different spectrum that I was like, maybe it's me. There's something wrong with me that I have all these different personalities, but
Mhm.
probably it's the AI that doesn't work because it's not stable.
Mm.
And that's sort of like when I talk to machine learning experts, that's like machine learning 101. That tool has to be reliable and stable because if I have different personality scores, every time I take a job interview or a video interview in this case, like we shouldn't use that criterion, right? Like if it's not
Mhm.
stable, we shouldn't be using it.
All right, it's time for another quick break. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to the Project HR podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Orqua, and my guest today is reporter and NYU journalism professor Hilke Schellmann. All right, we're back. And so obviously the results you experienced with AI-based interviews were flawed, which is concerning because both candidate livelihoods and corporate futures are at stake. So what are the ethics surrounding the use of these AI interview tools?
I mean, I think there are a ton of ethical questions around these tools, right? So, like, the first question is like, is it okay that these tools can be marketed to anyone? Like, shouldn't they be tested, right? And there are some experts who say, well, before you're allowed to bring a tool like this to market, there should be, at least an audit done to make sure that the tool is fair. And maybe also an audit that it works. So I think those are some questions. Those are some ethical concerns that people have. They also say, another ethical problem might be like, does the tool work for all? And we did that in the podcast series. We worked with folks who are disabled, who played some of the games with me. And in some of the games, in some of the AI games, you have to, for example, hit a space bar as fast as you can. So the first question is like that I had too is like, well, what does that have to do with any job relevance? Like I've never had a job where I had to hit the space bar or really any key on my keyboard as fast as I could, right? Like what does that have to do with the job? That's the first question. But if you have a motor disability and you can't do this as fast, you might be pushed out of the pool, right? Like you might
Mm.
not actually get over the threshold to get in the next round of hiring. And then the question is like, is this fair? So I think especially folks with disability, that's a real problem. Yes, by law, they can ask for an accommodation. But if you're sitting in front of an AI game, you don't know what's actually going to be asked of you. So how
Mhm.
can you ask for an accommodation?
Mhm.
Right. So I think those are a lot of questions. And, we ask these questions often around gender, is like, do women play this game the same way as men? Do the resume parsers work the same way for women and men? But I think there are other groups as well, and especially folks with disabilities that we really have to take into account and to see like, does this work for them? Like, does the tool actually work for folks who have, maybe a speech disability or people who have an accent? Like, there's all kinds of questions that we don't know if the tool actually is fair to all of them.
Mhm. Well, it sounds like it's a combination of both rights-based ethics and duty-based ethics where we need to think about everyone's right to a fair and equal process. And then also, we have a duty to make sure that the tool is actually doing what we say it does. So
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
that's
yeah. And Yeah. And, I was surprised that the law doesn't say the tool actually has to work. It just has to be fair to everyone. So technically, if you want to hire with a random number generator, that's fair
Mm,
because everyone has the same chance.
yep.
But does that pick the best people? Probably
Right.
not,
Yep.
it's just a
For
random
sure.
number generator, but that's not illegal.
Right.
The tool doesn't have to work, but I think companies would want the tool to work. So do job applicants, right? Like,
Yeah.
if I do a job interview, an AI based video interview, and I don't get the job because of merit, that's totally fine. But if I get it because, my facial expression wasn't the right facial expression in a job interview, what does it have to do with the job? Like, does
hmm
the technology actually work? If it's a flawed technology, I would be really upset that I didn't get the job.
Well, and speaking of rates-based ethics, the EEOC recently came out with a statement about the use of AI in hiring. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes. So, the folks that look at AI in hiring and how AI is used in, sort of everyday work life, they have always, there's been a lot of strong feelings about the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission that we have AI now in the workplace for years, and the EOC has really never really reacted to it and said, they keep saying, well, the rules that we have for 40, 50 years and, all of our laws, they still apply. But it is a little different for video interviews and hiring assessments, right? Because in the quote unquote old days, I knew if I wanted to have a firefighter job, I need to move, I need to carry this much equipment, these many pounds and do this and this. And I can go fight that in court, right? Like I can
hmm
go to
hmm
court and say, hey, I think this is unfair to women. Do firefighters really need to carry 200 pounds? And do they have to carry it this way? But today, we don't actually often know if AI is being used. And if it's being used, we don't know how it's actually classifying us.
hmm
So I don't actually know if something has been, if I've been wronged or what the actual test and assessment was. So it's really hard for job applicants to contest this in court, right? This used to be the old way. So everyone in this space has looked towards the EUC. We hadn't heard anything until recently. They came out with a statement with a technical advice to employers saying, hey, like we are seeing that artificial intelligence becoming this really big deal in hiring. um, all the laws apply, and especially look towards people with disabilities here.
hmm
Like you must accommodate them, and you must make sure that these tools are fair. If they're not fair and they discriminate against people with disabilities, we will use enforcement action against you. So
hmm
I think that was a very powerful statement from the EUC to say out loud, companies are responsible for
hmm
the technology they use from vendors.
Yeah.
Vendors are probably responsible too, but you have to check that the technology works. And I think that happens sometimes, sort of if you're like a mid-size to small company, you probably don't have a data scientist working for you that can test all these tools. I mean, this is like a lot of work and it takes a lot of knowledge. So a lot of times you think like, oh, well, this big company is using this tool. I'm going to trust the vendor, right? They're not going
hmm
to like sell me a faulty tool. Well, I think the EOC sort of really put it back the onus on the company to say, no, don't trust the vendor. This is your responsibility to make sure
hmm
this works, especially for people with disability. Because the problem is, it's sort of like disabilities are very personal, right? Like I might be autistic, you might be autistic, but our autism might come out in very different ways.
hmm
So we really can't put, there isn't a lot of training data that we can put into the AI to train for this. So AI is basically a pattern recognition technology, but the problem is people with disabilities often don't fit those patterns. So
hmm
how can we make sure they're being accommodated? So
Yeah.
it goes to the heart of AI. So I think companies will have a lot of work to figure this one out.
So we've talked a lot about the impact on the candidate experience that AI brings. Let's talk a little bit about how AI impacts the experience for employers.
So I think for employers, I think AI is a technology that really feels like, okay, it's coming into the space. It's really going to help me. And I think it is actually helpful. So I think, I'm not trying to advocate to go back to quote unquote the old ways where humans do the hiring, right? Because first of all, humans don't ever go through the whole pile of resumes. They get bored and they start looking for shortcuts, right? That's how you start looking at schools and be like, oh, this person went to Harvard, well, that must be smart. So I must interview them for the position, right? That's how these like human biases creep in.
Hmm.
And we've obviously seen humans have been very biased. Like for decades, women and people of color were underestimated in their abilities, right? Like we see this every day in the job market. So I'm not saying we should go back to that, but what I'm trying to say is like if we use AI, let's make sure it works, it's fair for everyone, and it doesn't, just because you have a disability, it leaves you out. So I think if employers want to use it, is a great efficiency saving, labor saving. You save a lot of money. It's a very structured process. I totally get it. You want to use it and make sure it works.
So, from an employer's perspective, can AI be an effective interviewer? I mean, does it get us better employees?
So I think AI can be an effective interviewer because it does, it forces the company to have a structured interview, asking every candidate the same question. That's
Mhm.
great. Does it find the best job applicants? We actually don't know that. I've been asking for years for any evidence of this, and there really isn't any evidence out there. What we really need to do is, and I hope that like some company will do it, have like a double track where maybe they hire folks with the traditional process and at the same time also use an AI system and have those two cohorts of employees then run parallel and really understand the label that the job applicants got 2 years ago, that was like maybe red or green or whatever label, did this actually turn out to be predictive of the success in the job? I haven't seen this. Look, these are very longitudinal studies that would take years. Most HR departments aren't set up for this, and they don't want to work closely, maybe that closely with academics. I think another way to think through this would also be, sort of what we do for if we test medications, right? We have two cohorts running. We have double blind tests. You don't know if you get the placebo or not. And then we figure out over time, does this actually work? So that's another way to do it, but that takes years and is very cost intensive. Also, the truth is like most companies don't actually have a good sense or enough data on their current employees anyway. So they wouldn't know like how many did we hire 3 years, how many are successful. And, labeling employees as successful, that's also another thing that's like, sort of contested. What makes you a successful employee
Mm.
outside of a sales job, right? In sales, I can count how many items have you sold and can compare you to others, although maybe if you're a total jerk and maybe you're selling the most, maybe I don't know if I want you on the team, another
Mhm.
question.
Mhm.
But for most jobs, it's actually really hard to say who is successful and what makes you successful, right?
Mhm.
There's teachers who have very different ways to teach. We have tried teachers algorithms in New York City and in Texas to understand how effective are teachers. Those algorithms were abandoned 10 years ago. I mean, I'm sure they were very, very basic, but they didn't work.
Mhm.
So I think there's a lot here that's actually very, very complicated to untangle. So we don't actually have any evidence yet that these tools find the best job applicants.
So, given all of this, do you think that AI job interview tools can bring value to an organization?
I think they can bring value if you really think through how can I use them. I think what's helpful is to think through like maybe it's not only a job interview. Maybe it's also important to look at people's resumes. Maybe understand what drives them from a personal way. Also understanding like do they have actually the skills to work in this job. So I think if you have like the more holistic approach to have you hiring, the better your assessment of job applicants will be.
Mhm.
I understand that that is very cost intensive,
Mhm.
and people turn to AI because they need something that's more efficient. But I think you also have to understand as HR that if there's not enough people out there for the jobs that you hire for, a job interview could really, a video job interview could really turn off some folks that you might want to hire because they feel, oh, this company isn't doing anything. I've heard this again and again that candidates say, oh, I don't want to work for this company because they don't even put in the bare minimum to have a human interaction with me or human conversation. So I think that's something to think about for companies.
So what do you think would need to change to make them more valuable?
So I think what we need is like transparency and testing. So I think what we need to know is like what goes into these algorithms. How's the, what's the training data? How's the algorithm coming together to really understand, okay, do we have any problems in the training data here, right? So we don't want to do what like Amazon did, where they built an AI that was used for resumes, and the training data consisted of mostly male resumes. So it started to downweigh resumes that had the word woman, women, and some, historically female colleges in there. So we don't want to do that. So looking at the training data is very important. Also understanding what are the results of the algorithm? Is this fair? Do all the different groups, do men versus women, do they pass at the same rates? Or does it, for whatever reason, exclude most of the women? Like, we don't want that, because then it can't be a fair tool. So I think rigorous testing, vigorous transparency. And I think that the problem with that is that, vendors often feel, well, this is my proprietary algorithm. This is how I make the money, but we need to know a little bit more about this, and we need to be able to stress test it, as I say, or test it or audit it to make sure that it does work. And I think we're moving in that direction. I think there's there's a New York City law. We'll see how it's actually gonna shake out, what the mandatory procedures are for companies. But there are laws starting. We have the GDPR, the general privacy data laws in the European Union that guide a lot of how do we store the data. It's another ethical issue. It's like, if I do a video interview with a company, what is being done to my likeness? What is being done to the video? Do I have access to it? Are they going to delete it? What do they do? And I think what I've understood is that it's mostly being stored, and it's then being used to retrain other algorithms. So you may not want to do that, or you don't want to grant companies that access to your data and your likeness, right? This is like really personal data. It's my voice, my likeness, what I say, so people feel strongly about this.
All right. If we want to learn more about you, your work with MIT Technology Review, where can we go?
So the MIT Technology Review podcast is, In Machines We Trust, is everywhere where you find your podcast. It's always available. And you can find me on LinkedIn. I have also a faculty page at NYU. There's only one Hilke Schellmann, so you'll definitely find me. Yep. And I love when people, share their experiences. I'm really interested in folks who work on all sides of this and interact with AI.
All right. And again, links to Hilke's In Machines We Trust podcast series, its accompanying article will all be noted in this week's episode companion, which you can grab for free at iriconsultants.com/podcast. Right now, though, Hilke, it is time for our lightning round questions. These are questions we ask of every guest of the podcast. Are you ready?
Yes.
All right. Our first question is always a topic showdown. In this episode, we've been talking about AI and job interviews. So in your opinion, Hilke, which fictional sentient AI system is more terrifying? The Matrix from the Matrix films or Skynet from the Terminator?
It's always the Matrix. And it's so scary because it's like a whole separate universe that runs us, right? And we are just like, like those people in like, I don't know what that weird like cocoon is that they're in, but it's like a whole different reality, and I think that's way more scary than anything else.
Excellent. All right, next question. What is the best book you've read recently?
So my favorite book has really nothing to do with AI.
That's okay.
But what I've recently read and which really moved me is The Warmth of Other Suns. And it's about the great migration of African Americans from the South to the North and to the West. And it's just these like super personal stories following people over decades, recounting their experiences. And it's pretty wild because I cried at the end of a nonfiction book. I don't think I've ever cried at the end of a nonfiction book ever. And I was so moved by these people who I've never met. But it is like it was kind of a life-changing book to get that in-depth knowledge.
Yeah, that sounds really powerful. All right, next question. What is your favorite thing about the work that you do?
I think my favorite thing about the work that I do is like talking to people who experience these systems, talking to people who use these systems, and also like, I'm not going to lie, I do like the testing of these systems and sort of, poking a little bit at them and seeing like, hey, do you work? I'm gonna try this out. So I feel incredibly blessed that folks trust me with their stories. I mean, I think that's just the most amazing and humbling thing to do.
All right, next question is, what is the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
I've had a great mentor who told me if something is too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. So I have used that in my journalism to maybe be a little skeptical, right? Like if somebody comes along and says, hey, we found the holy grail to video interviews with AI because we can track facial expressions, tone of voice, and the words that we use better than any human ever could. We found the holy grail. I was like, whoa, this might be magic. Or maybe this is too good to be true. Then you start looking into it.
For sure. All right, last question. Who or what inspires you?
I mean, I think what inspires me is like sort of a great history of investigative journalists who put themselves out there and, tested these tested tools, but also like went into, institution to find out how people are being treated. And some people, they risk their lives doing that. So that's a really big inspiration for me. Also, my daughter inspires me. She's 2. She's a toddler, and she sees the world in like the most amazing ways and comes up with the most amazing connections. So she inspires me kind of to be the best human and mother I can be. I'm sure a lot of parents can relate to that.
Very nice, for sure. Hilke, thanks so much for joining me today on this week's episode of Project HR.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
I also want to thank those listening in. Here's a final reminder to unlock your access to this episode's companion guide at iriconsultants.com/podcast. If you're ready for your Project HR debut, our team is always looking for outstanding guests. Let us know about your expertise by emailing us, projecthr@iriconsultants.com. This wraps up our final episode for 2022. From everyone here at Project HR, we wish you a very happy holidays and a happy new year. We also want to let you know that for 2023, Project HR will move from our weekly format to a bi-weekly one. That's a new show every other week. So don't forget to subscribe to Project HR to keep up. Finally, we do hope you'll drop us a line, leave us a review, or give the show a handful of stars wherever you get your content. That's all for this week's episode of Project HR. Let's make it a great day at work.